Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to topic 2 of this week, which I will make sure that this reflects that before I post this to Moodle. But in the meantime, today we are going to talk finally about the downfall of the Soviet Union and how the world began to transition into a post-Cold War world. I'll learn how to talk effectively eventually. But in the meantime, we do have quite a few key terms to go through, but this lesson still shouldn't take us at the very least any longer than the last one. But in the meantime, we are going to be looking at Mikhail Gorbachev. We'll look at the oil glut. We'll look at the Soviet anti-alcohol campaign. We'll look at the perestroika. We'll look at the August coup. And we'll conclude by looking at the collapse of the Berlin Wall. As always, I do, of course, want to make sure, again, you're aware of all important upcoming assignments. But since I did mention those in my last lesson, I won't go into too much detail here. But just remember, you do have this information here, and to let me know if you have any questions. But in the meantime, to introduce this topic for us, I'd like you all to follow this link to a video right here of this gentleman singing a song about the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, to be quite frank, it is not the best song I've ever heard in my life, but I do think it does a very good job of giving a summary of the fall of the Soviet Union. So please do check this out. Go ahead and pause this video and check that out, and then we'll get right back to what we were doing before. Probably could have phrased that better, but oh well. Alright, now that you've hopefully watched that, let's jump into the thick of things. So, on December 25th, ironically of course on Christmas in 1991, the Soviet flag flew over the Kremlin in Moscow for the last time. Many of course were asking how something like this could have happened, and historians have since identified three major causes for the ultimate downfall of the Soviet Union. First, there was the economic inefficiency of the Soviet Union, which we already addressed a few weeks ago. There were also intense ethnic tensions throughout the Soviet Union, particularly in their satellite states we mentioned a while back, and the acceleration reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, also known again as the perestroika. Now, first thing we're going to do is jump into Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the last elected General Secretary of the Soviet Union, essentially their president or prime or whatever you'd want to call it. He was elected on March 11, 1985, and it is his policies that he enacted due to his inherited problems that have largely been credited with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Few issues he had to deal with. First, we already discussed the stagnant economy of the Soviet Union. According to sociologist Vladimir Shlopentok, which I probably butchered that pronunciation, in the last decades of the USSR's existence, the rate of economic growth steadily decreased, the quality of goods deteriorated, and technological process slowed. Now, as a review, when we talk about that CIA report on the Soviet Union's economy, why had the growth of it slowed so dramatically? Very good. Once again, if you remember, a lot of it was the lack of competition that existed in the USSR because of excessive state control. With the USSR not having any competition to inspire innovation, as you see here, again, the quality of the goods deteriorated and the quality of service deteriorated. And also because of intensive Soviet control over the media and the economy as well, there was that lack of price controls we mentioned, so there was essentially no way the Soviet economy could anticipate how prices were going to change, so there was no way to plan ahead to have a structured economy. So essentially, again, the Soviet Union shows the downfall of having a communist economy paired with a totalitarian government. Not very efficient. Now, one of the more interesting problems of the Soviet Union was the rampant alcoholism. For example, throughout the 1970s, alcohol sales alone took up 1/3 of government revenue through alcohol taxes. The consumption doubled between 1955 and 1979 to 15.2 liters per person a year. To put this into perspective, this is about 3 times the current global average. And that is the current average, by the way. So your average American, so anyone you know who would drink or anyone in this country who drinks, they probably at most only drink about 4 or 5 liters per year. Soviet Union had that beat by 3 times. Also, Gorbachev had older political opponents who were established politicians who liked traditional Soviet policies, who would be opposed to later reforms he would enact. We'll get to that a little bit later. Anyway, get things started off. One thing that made the Soviet economy even worse was the so-called oil glut. This oil glut took place began on September the 13th in 1985, when the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia announced that the Minister of Oil announced that the country was going to end its restraint on oil production and increase its share in the market. Essentially, to put this in not economic terms, for anyone who might be a little confused, is just that Saudi Arabia is no longer going to have any real limits on how much oil it's going to produce. So it's going to produce huge amounts of oil to try to essentially take over the entire oil market. To give you an idea of how this is going to affect the oil market, think about what's happened to movies and studios who are not owned by Disney. Very good, my movie fans in here. As some of you may know, since Disney now owns so many movie studios and production companies, they get the lion's share, really, of all movie profits in any given year. The same thing's essentially happening with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world. Since Saudi Arabia is going to flood the oil market with their oil, as you can see here, it will drop oil prices by about 60% because the market's essentially getting oversaturated and demand's going to go down. But they're still going to get the lion's share of the profits, so they don't really care. And of course, the rest of the world is not going to get as much of a profit because they can't match Saudi Arabia's oil production. Now, this of course affected the Soviet Union pretty directly by causing them to lose approximately $20 billion in revenue per year. Pretty big slice of change, obviously, which made the Soviet Union's economy problems only worse. Now, one of the other more interesting aspects, like I said, that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union is not something really that you would expect. This was Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign. In May of 1985, Gorbachev announced a Kremlin campaign to limit alcohol consumption. As part of this campaign, the prices of beer, wine, and vodka were raised. Punch cards were given out which rationed alcohol purchases. And a government propaganda campaign was undertaken to censor old movies that had any reference to alcohol. Now, to also put this in a little bit of context, has America ever done anything similar to this? Very good. Those of you who are at home who were paying attention earlier, this is of course very similar to America's Prohibition campaign. Although actually, in some ways, this is less ambitious than America's plan, but in some ways more ambitious. On the one hand, they didn't take the step to outlaw alcohol completely like we did, but America, as far as I know, never went the extra mile to start censoring things that even referenced alcohol. Now, Gorbachev justified this campaign by claiming that it would increase worker productivity by 10%. However, it actually had pretty direct impacts on the Soviet economy. First, due to the loss of alcohol sales, the tax revenue of the government decreased by 100 billion rupees annually. Quite a bit of money. Also, the poor Soviets who were not willing to give up this alcohol for whatever reason, who couldn't afford the tax, would essentially turn to substances such as antifreeze, nail polish remover, rubbing alcohol, and even men's cologne. This literally created a significant enough health crisis that it burdened the Soviets' poor healthcare system with all the new patients. Now, one joke I found that I thought was actually kind of funny that helps summarize the Soviets' feelings towards Gorbachev because of this is this old Soviet joke. And the joke goes, there was this long line for vodka, and one poor guy couldn't stand it any longer. I'm going to go to the Kremlin to kill Gorbachev, he said. An hour later, he came back. The line was still there, and everyone asked him, did you kill him? Kill him, he responded. The line for that's even longer than this one. Hopefully someone appreciates that cheesiness, but again, it does show how unpopular this campaign made Gorbachev, making his hold on power a bit even more shaky than it already was. Getting into some of the other reasons for the downfall of the Soviet Union, we'll look at ethnic conflicts for a little bit. Now, think about what Stalin did after the end of World War II with his Iron Curtain, for example. Why might ethnic conflicts be such a threat in a nation or a confederation like the USSR? Very good. Those of you who maybe, for example, were paying attention to this map. The Soviet Union, as you might know, since it controlled many satellite nations, wasn't just one group of a bunch of however many million ethnic Russians. Due to the Soviet Union consuming all these other countries, there are actually many different ethnicities all being controlled by the Soviet Union. For any of you who knows what happens for instances like colonization or imperialism, where one mother country tries to control many other groups and ethnicities and force them together, this can often lead to conflict with groups that don't typically get along, but are being forced together. The Soviet Union was absolutely no different. What many would consider to be the start of these major ethnic conflicts for the Soviet Union began in December of 1986. This was when Gorbachev appointed an ethnic Russian as the head of the Communist Party in Kazakhstan. This was seen, of course, as even less independence for the Kazakhstanian people, however you would say that, and of course, many of them did not like having their affairs dictated by an outsider. Eventually, 10,000 troops were sent to dispel rioters in the capital of Alma-Ata, which resulted in a large riot. Now, due to the press and the exposure this event got, various conflicts like this started to spread all across the USSR. For example, in 1987, Armenian and ethnic word I can't pronounce began to fight throughout their country as well. In 1988, Georgia established its own Popular Front, and by 1989, 20 Georgians had been killed in various demonstrations across the country. In September of 1989, the Ukraine had established its own Congress, and by March of 1990, Lithuania had officially declared independence. So again, once these ethnic conflicts started to spring up across the USSR, various other countries controlled by the Soviets used this as an opportunity to try to seek their own independence. Very similarly to how various countries tried to gain independence after World War II was over. But anyway, in the meantime, we'll just look at the perestroika reforms Gorbachev tried to pass. In order to address this ailing economy, Gorbachev passed a series of laws that were meant to stimulate the economy, but eventually weakened the total control of the USSR. A few examples of this. In January of 1987, Gorbachev proposed an election system within the Communist Party. So there would still just be one Communist Party, but you would still have to elect people, or you'd be able to elect people now. Between February and July of the same year, he released various political prisoners and began to allow public political demonstrations with no penalties. By May of 1988, the law of cooperatives was passed, which allowed for private ownership of businesses and industry. Now, why do you think these reforms, which seem positive, would be crucial in causing the downfall of the Soviet Union? Very good. Once again, students at home, coupled with the ethnic conflicts that are already going on and the overall unpopularity of Gorbachev and the Soviet government, this encouraging of increased freedom is just going to give people freedom to speak out against the Soviet government and eventually to reject it. So while it did have some positives in helping to stimulate the economy and allowing for political freedom, it wasn't really good for a government that had typically relied on excessive control in order to maintain its power. The perestroika went a long way to helping to undermine that control. For example, after the perestroika was passed, various other satellite nations, as you already mentioned, began to further increase their independence, which is perhaps best symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall. By November 9th of 1989, again due to this increased freedom, the East German government announced that Berlin's citizens would now move freely between both zones. So now essentially the most symbolic divide between the Eastern and Western world, or the capitalist and communist world, now means absolutely nothing. The Brandenburg Gate, which you can see here, was eventually also opened by December the 22nd of the same year. And the wall itself, as you can see the process beginning here, was finally demolished between June 13th of 1990 and November of 1991. During this time, Germany was officially reunified by October the 3rd of 1990. So again, one of the greatest satellite nations of the Soviet Union and the greatest symbols of this communist divide was now over, essentially for many beginning to signal the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. The final collapse of the Soviet Union began to occur by 1991. On August 19th of that year, there was the infamous August coup. During this coup, Gorbachev was put under house arrest to prevent him from signing a new Union treaty. This treaty would have essentially made the USSR a federation of independent republics. So instead of being unified behind Russia, these countries would all be completely independent and would just come together in times of crisis or mutual need. Now, interestingly enough, this coup was failed after 3 days and Gorbachev was reinstated, but why is it significant? Like, why does the coup matter that only lasted 3 days? Very good. Once again, viewers at home, it really shows a couple of things. First, it shows how far towards individual liberty and political liberty Gorbachev is willing to go. That he's essentially even considering just giving up the USSR almost entirely and just setting up a series of independent governments. However, it also shows that Gorbachev is highly vulnerable and highly unpopular. He essentially was seen to have no real political authority after this was over, because even though Gorbachev was reinstated, it seemed clear to everyone that he could be taken down and lose his power at any time. For example, in the wake of this coup, from August to December of that year, 10 republics, beginning with the Ukraine on August 24th, began to declare independence. Finally, on December 25th at 7:32, the Soviet flag was lowered and the state anthem was played for the last time as Gorbachev left the Kremlin. The Russian tricolor flag was raised at 11:40 p.m., signaling the end of the USSR and the independence of all of its nations. Now, looking ahead to the impact a little bit, which we will be talking about towards the end of the semester, how exactly is the collapse of this going to impact the rest of the world? Keep that in mind, but that's all I have for you at this point. Just please do remember your upcoming assignments, and once again, let me know if you have any questions. Have a great rest of your week.